So as we heard in this introduction, and what I usually speak about is actually linguistics. But today I thought that I could make a little bit of a different lecture because I wanted to talk a little bit more broader about communication. And linguistics is just one part of, or one, let's say, one way uh, um, of analyzing communication, because language is just one part of communication, right? Um, Communication is not only verbal or what is written or what is said. Communication is actually the exchange of information. Now, the way in which we exchange information can go very well and a lot beyond the language itself, right? So, in this talk, I wanted to cover some of the topics where, and definitely not all of them, and you will see that some very big fields in communication research I'm leaving out. Um, so you will see that there are a lot of topics when it comes to communication that are actually useful and being used and being, let's say, explored for good or bad purposes. They're being explored in different fields, including industry, right? Including industry. So what I will talk about is here is follow several topics that I think are interesting that will hopefully make us think a little bit about this and see what the application of studying communication is. Um, Let me see. Okay, so what is the menu for today? What are we going to be talking about? We're going to be talking about why is important to take into consideration other parts of communication, not just language. What is communication? What is mass communication? Which is a topic that I will talk about briefly because I believe that this is something that is really important nowadays, and I think that we are more and more aware of the, let's say, the strategies that are used in mass communication. And the more aware we are of them, the more we can, decide to be affected by them or not. And in relation to the mass communication, I will cover some important concepts that people who are studying mass communication are aware of, and are using to their advantage, such as the confirmation bias. And related to that is unconscious bias, such as the imageability, and such as the role or visual perception or visual attention. And then I will talk about something that is more, let's say, a linguistic side of the whole communication research. And that is actually the discourse analysis, which is a separate, let's say, subfield within the communication research, and which relies heavily on the still linguistic elements, right? So analyzing language, but taking into consideration everything we know about communication and putting things a little bit about in the context of, who the people who are talking are, maybe some psychological and sociological factors, etc. Right? And here I will talk about the powerful and powerless speech. These are the two labels that we're using for the speech styles. And this goes both for speaking and written language. And then I will go back to what we started with, and this is media, and how people are nowadays investigating discourse analysis in media, and what we know about discourse analysis in advertising, and how can we maybe learn something from it, right? Okay, so what is just a second. I just want to get rid of this so that I can see my slides. Okay, okay. So what is the communication research? Well, communication research is a very, very broad topic, and you will see a lot of, different different labels and different definitions. and different names for basically the same thing. But in broad sense, communication research identifies, explores, and measures all the factors that surround communication, right? Um, from any form and regarding any topic, anything that can affect the way we communicate, right? Um, so one thing that I should say here is that previously um, when I was talking about research in linguistics, etc., I was talking about research that is done in a quantitative way, which means that usually experiments are being performed in experimental setting. Then people do quantitative statistics and they have quantitative data to draw their conclusions on. Communication research is using qualitative research methods. What that means is that they are saying something about the quality and the method in which they are describing the data that they draw their conclusions on is qualitative, meaning descriptive, right? So this is not really exact science, whatever I say here, meaning that we're usually going to be talking about something that people observe that is happening, and then they will take a corpus or do some kind of studying of texts or interviews or videos to be able to describe what's happening and try to detect the patterns of behaviors, of communications, of communicative devices, of linguistic structures. But there is no quantitative statistical measurement that will tell us for sure things like just if you use this, then that, right? Rather, the researchers are trying to describe what they see. Maybe they will offer some kind of descriptive statistics to say this structure is being used in these situations in this percentage, the other one in other percentage, etc. But just keep in mind that we are trying to, this is one of the fields that is using qualitative methods, meaning we are describing the observations and trying to detect the patterns and maybe some kind of regularities so that we can draw some conclusions about it, but we can never be sure. um, So some questions then communication research, just so you can get a glance at the beginning. Some questions that communication research might be dealing with is, for example, how to make political messages more effective, right? Or the other way around, how are the politicians making their messages more effective so that it affects us in the way that they want, right? You can reverse it. How to increase the effectiveness of an advertisement, right? If you are somebody who's making an advertisement, or if you're a consumer, maybe you want to detect, or if you're somebody who's interested in consumers rather than selling the product, maybe you want to know what are they actually trying to do by making the advertisement in that way. What kind of factors are they here manipulating so that they sell the product, right? But also, it's not always that, let's say, negative and manipulative and capitalistic. Sometimes you have causes that are good for the benefit of the others, that we can use communication research to achieve those aims, such as maybe a country's medical or health organization can create advertisement campaign to adhere to a certain health regulations, right? Or it can go, this is all more or less the 3 points here, something that has to do with mass communication that I will mention next, but it can be much more individual. Communication research also deals with things such as when we are at job interviews, what kind of behaviors, what kind of communication styles are maybe leaving a better impression on the interviewer, um, or in general worse impression, or in general what is more effective and what not, right? So this could all be topics that a person who is doing a communication research is dealing with. Now, why is studying communication different than language, the studying language, right? Well, we should understand here that language is not an isolated system, right? Language exists in a society, and languages exist in a culture, and language is part of people's cognitive systems. All these separate systems, social, psychological, cognitive, and cultural, are going to be shaping the language that we use, both consciously and most importantly subconsciously, right? And you will see that throughout this talk I will be focusing on the subconscious factors. This is what the interesting part, right? We can choose our words, and that choice can be influenced by different factors, but there are even things that we don't even consciously choose that are again and still communicating something to the others and how we are perceived, right? Um, Language is also very important for expressing things, and this is shaped by our culture, right? Including how we express our emotions. Um, but words don't just help us define concepts and emotions, they might determine, and this theory is called linguistic relativity or the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, they might define how we think, how we see the world, right? And vice versa. How we see the world and how things are in the culture might define what words we have for it, right? So here you can see on the right in this diagram that, for example, the concept of colors and what is considered one color and what is considered another might differ on the culture, right? Depending on, it is believed that this depends on whether one culture has the need to distinguish between all these concepts, right? So in English, what is all considered blue, in Russian, for example, you would have two different words for it, right? Because it's culturally different, right? So all these not just that our culture shapes the language consciously, but also subconsciously, and our beliefs also, as we will see later. Now, mass communication, it could create is transferring that information, having all these factors into account, transferring all that information on a large scale to a wide range of people, right? It is the process of creating, sending, receiving, and analyzing messages to large audiences. And this can go through verbal, written, or digital media, right? And here I have some resources, some handbooks in case you're interested in discovering more about this. But when we're talking about mass communications, we are talking about these first three basically scenarios, right? When we have people, when we have politicians talking, what they are doing is mass communications, right? So the way in which they choose the words is not going to be the same as the way in which I choose the words when I'm, talking to you now, or maybe talking to my friend, or etc. Because our goals and aims are different. In the case of a politician, he's trying to communicate a message and communicate and get a certain reaction, which is very important, like elicit certain types of feelings or behaviors or beliefs in a very big group of people, right? So we have a lot of psychology happening there, and by that I mean, well, I will talk about this, right? So this is what we mean by mass communication, and there are a lot of different theories about that. The most important one has been the so what kind of strategies do people use in mass communication? We know that there are many of them. So what a mass communication researcher would do is they would look at, say, speeches of politicians, or maybe they would look at some kind of interviews, and they would see what actually implicitly are people doing, what is the structure of their narrative, um, when they are communicating something. And a very common strategy that is detected by many researchers is framing, and the other one is agenda setting, right? So if you have a certain agenda that you want to go for, we know that politicians do, they will choose certain phrases. They will organize their speeches in a certain way. They will put focus on certain things. They will use certain words and not the others to label certain people or certain things. Um, they will use certain tone. They will use certain metaphors to express something and elicit emotions or reactions from the people, etc. This is all part of of their strategy to communicate a certain thing to us and for us to exactly make the conclusion that they want us to make, right? And in the case of politicians, I'm taking an extreme example because politicians actually have people working with them who are aware of all this, right? So usually when they make speeches and when they give interviews, they know they're trained and advised on all this. But sometimes, maybe not in politics, but sometimes these things are being done even half subconsciously, right? So, in this part, I will present several important concepts in mass communication. And by concepts, it's, let's say, factors that affect communication and that people who are, as I said, working in that field are aware of. The first one is confirmation bias. And that has to do just with the fact that we are humans, right? So, when people engage and consume information, they are much more likely to engage in the information that is in some way affirming our identities or how we see ourselves, and it somehow aligns with our values, right? So in the case of mass communication, if you want to communicate something to a large group of people, you want to know what that group of people wants to hear. That is basically what the confirmation bias is. And we have this internal inclination that we always seek the already existing beliefs to be confirmed, right? So one good example, and I don't want to step on anybody's toes here, you can believe in whatever you want to believe, but a very good example is a horoscope, right? Especially those daily horoscopes in the newspapers, right? They usually use when they say something about, I don't know, Aquarius today, expect good news, right? um, so because you read that, you will look for anything that happens to you during the day to call it those good news that you were expecting, right? Or for example, they would say very general things. I don't know. Aquarius, they are really, really emotional people. And you believe yourself to be emotional, so you will look for that information, for that confirmation of something that you think about yourself. So a lot of us find ourselves in these descriptions and in these predictions of what will happen to us just because we fit the expected we kind of fit the reality into the expected outcomes, right? We want something that we believe to be confirmed. We have that need. This is a subconscious process. We don't do this on purpose. um, but what that means, because it's subconscious, it means that it can be very, very dangerous, especially in the certain professions where you need to fight it. For example, I'm a scientist and I do a lot of experiments, and I would with language, and I would set up an experiment where I would expect a certain effect to occur or to find a certain things. And because I'm expecting or believing that to be true, I have a confirmation bias. So I will look at my results and I have to fight this confirmation bias a lot. This is why we have statistical analysis, right? To make sure that I don't conclude that effect is there just because I want it to be there, but rather that the data is showing it, right? So when people are mass communicating, for example, advertisements are a very good example for that. You have to do consumer research, right? To see what people want to hear actually. Because the facts that oppose people's views, or there is some way new or unexpected, you have to communicate them in a way that does not completely, crash with their beliefs, meaning you have to choose your words and you have to choose what you're going to say so that people are not completely surprised. Because when something is really at odds with what they believe or what they want to hear, people are not so responsive to that kind of information. Meaning they won't maybe remember it, they will buy a product, whatever the aim of your communication is. This is a problem, and this comes from something that is called unconscious bias. And actually, a lot of the things I'm going to be talking about boils down to these unconscious bias factors or implicit stereotypes, right? And this is not bad. This is just us being humans. We have certain beliefs that are affecting, and we cannot fight it because this is subconscious. Our beliefs are affecting our judgments and our assessments of something as much as we are trying to be objective, right? And this goes with language too. When somebody's communicating to us, we make a lot of conclusions based on these implicit stereotypes that we have about maybe a person, about maybe the language that it is being spoken to, etc., etc. So we don't just look at the content, right? This is not a problem, but it is a problem again if you want to minimize it. For example, in media, these unconscious bias, if you are not careful and you're, for example, a journalist or a news reporter, you might choose the words, not wanting subconsciously, but because of this stereotype, you might choose the words that are setting certain groups of people in a bad context, right? So this is why at the universities, for example, I had to go through trainings where you are trained to recognize unconscious bias in your own behavior and try to minimize it as much as possible, right? For example, you would choose different words to describe um, a judge that is a woman versus a judge that is a man, because we have some unconscious stereotypical bias about maybe women not being professional enough, right? And these are the things that come from our culture, that come from how the world is, right? So hopefully that would change. um, so this is one thing, the bias that is important in mass communication. The other thing that is important in mass communication is a thing called imageability. For example, when you are describing things and using language to describe things, either spoken or written, the experiments have shown that, excuse me, that readers understand or remember the material or messages better when they are expressed in a language that is concrete or imaginable or imaginable, right? Why? Because it creates them much more clear visual imagery and visual images, which then makes our memory about the event or makes our mental representation of the message that we are hearing much more strong, right? We as humans, this is again just us being humans and having the human brains. Why? Well, humans like to to conceptualize, I'm sorry, there's a typo, to conceptualize the world around us in concrete terms, right? We like to describe the world in a way that we can see, touch, feel, smell, hear, right? This is when something is concrete. And this is reflected in the language a lot. You will see that many abstract terms we express through metaphors or metonymy, right? What is metaphors and metonymy? This is using one thing to describe another. It's usually the fact that we use a word for something concrete to describe something that is not concrete, right? So, for example, we say, I go through life as if life was a location, right? Or a path. Life is not something that you can walk through. There is no surface in life. Life is a conceptual, it's an abstract noun, right? But see, we always use this kind of language to make abstract things more concrete. so that we can understand them better, you know. Or always problems or disagreements in our problem are always somehow conceptualized as a physical fight, like he lost an argument, as if you can lose it, um, or as a war, etc. Right? Why? Because our brains are such that we like to conceptualize, and this is why when you're doing communication or mass communication, you should be aware of that thing, that using concrete or imaginable language uh, helps in basically getting your message through better. And besides that, I will also here mention another thing that people in communication are also using, and another factor, how you react to the messages that you hear, or the messages that you receive. There is one very good way, if any of you is interested in mass communication, and that is eye movements. This is why people are now using eye tracking. This is also good in marketing research, but how we react to messages into language that we read or we hear can be inferred from our eye movements, actually, right? Because communication sometimes can come also in the shape of pictures. This is also communication, right? When you see an advertisement, and it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to contain the, the language, right? It can contain just pictures. And in this case, also, what attracts our attention is a really, really informative way of finding out how the message is being received. Okay, so now that we dealt with more a little bit general topics in communication and certain things that people who are working in communication are aware of and paying attention to, the factors that they're paying attention to and factoring in their work. Now I would like to go to something a little bit more linguistic, right? Now, discourse analysis is a subfield of linguistics, actually, but it is still a subfield of linguistics that is, you know, branching out a little bit to other sciences to take all these factors into account. So what is discourse analysis? Discourse analysis is the analysis of written, spoken, or signed language. However, rather than just, you know, analyzing the language per se, it tries to reveal the reasons, you know, behind choosing certain language, written or spoken. It aims to reveal the sociological or psychological characteristics of people who are producing the what is being analyzed, the language that is being analyzed, rather than, you know, pure text structure. What is a very important fact about the discourse analysis is that it's taking context into account. As I said, who is speaking, where's that person coming from, who is the person speaking to, and most importantly, the communicative aims, right? So in discourse analysis, we would have, for example, the analysis of texts that are trying to um, they're trying to, let's say, come to the conclusion of what kind of, for example, text structure is used to achieve a certain communicative aim. That is one way, for example, to use to go about discourse analysis. So it is not just talking about language, but also everything around it. Second. Okay. One very important topic. I don't know if I, okay. One very important topic that actually I wanted to, you know, spend some time on today is the difference between powerful versus powerless speech. For me, this was a very, for me personally, this was the first thing about, let's say, more discourse analysis and more broadly communication that I encountered from a linguistic point of view. And it really shows how all these factors that I mentioned, the implicit stereotypes, the unconscious bias, etc., etc., how this all works uh, in our perception of what is being said. And a very, I would say that there are certain areas where this has been a particularly important topic. One of them is job interviews, for example, in the context of language learners, legal context, etc. Why? Because in these scenarios, when you're a job interview or at language assessment, you are doing a language test and there is somebody assessing you, or the legal context, such as you're at court, your defendant in the court, right? How people perceive you and how people perceive what you are speaking is crucial because it will decide on, whether you get the job interview. It will decide on what kind of mark or grade or note you get at the language assessment, and it will decide you. For example, I don't know if you ever watched a trial. I sometimes watch them on YouTube. It's interesting because all the everything about how somebody's behaving in a court at the stand is very informative for the jury, right? To conclude whether they believe that person, for example, whether that person is guilty or not. Not just the words that the person is using, but also the way in which things are being said, um, etc. And again, I'm not always talking about conscious decisions by these people. For example, at the job interview, I'm not saying that if you go to a job interview and an employer is listening to you, that they are aware of the fact that they are actually taking into account the words that you're saying, the intonation, the whether you are very confident or not, etc. Some of these things might be conscious to them, but a lot of these are very subconscious. And there are studies on this to show exactly that, because then we can have some value and maybe it can be useful for us to maybe try to employ it in our future and to say, okay, if I don't know, choosing these kinds of structure or this kind of tone is useful for me, if it's being perceived as positive during the job interview, maybe I want to practice and use it myself, right? So it has been found in general that certain characteristics of speech, and here I said both linguistic and non-linguistic, or paralinguistic, such as intonation, they affect listeners or a person that we're talking to. They affect their perception of us, and that in turn affects how they are perceived as, job candidates, language learners, etc. So the choice of the words, the way we pronounce them, etc., subconsciously signal something. They subconsciously communicate something to the listener. About what? About many things about us, about whether we are confident, if we are in a case of job interviews, about our knowledge, maybe in case of language assessment, about whether we are honest in a case of trial and court, etc. Now, what is the powerful versus powerless speech? So, as you can see here, I provided a lot of references. There are a lot of papers that have dealt with this over the years and decades, indeed. In case you want to look at the particular things, but to summarize it, overall, researchers have identified certain structures and classify them into certain groups. And these structures have been shown across studies to be perceived as powerless speech, right? So words such as hedges, when you're using a lot of words such as kinda, I think, I guess, sometimes, sort of, maybe, probably, a little bit, some, all of these are done in English, of course, as 90% of research in languages. When you're using, but I'm sure that they apply to all other languages. Here's a research idea if anybody's interested. Um, but using a lot of these words makes you being perceived as having a powerless speech, right? That if you use hesitations such as and all kinds of right, Well, then pauses, big unnatural pauses between words, or mm, all these are called hesitations. They make your speech less powerful. Also, if you end your sentences in English with right, isn't it? Don't you think? These are called tagged questions. They sometimes, not always, sometimes can be perceived as powerless. If you use discourse markers, and this is a problem for young people, I would say nowadays they use a lot of like, I was like, and then like, right? These are the discourse markers that actually carry no content, but make you sound less assertive, less powerful, right? And even if you're overusing, this is the last thing, the last two things are generally good. But if you're overusing intensifier, such as so, very, surely, really, definitely, a lot, always, or polite forms, if you're too polite, such as overusing thank you, please, sir, etc., sometimes that is perceived as less powerful, as powerless, right? So you can see that obviously some of these things, if you're like, if English is not your first language, like to me, and if you're coming from a different culture, and in your culture, for example, it's very normal to use a lot of thank you and please and sir. This is an important piece of information, for example, because all these studies are usually done in the context of, a lot of them are done in job interviews context. So it's good to know if you're, having a job interview in English language to, don't go crazy with the politeness, and don't use hedges and hesitations. Um, so using these forms together with some other characteristics of speech, and in these papers that I cite here, the studies, they also do that. For example, they show that other characteristics of speech, such as tone, rhythm, intonation, etc., can be perceived as less powerful, and also less authoritative, such as if you're talking in a very high pitch, um, you're seen as less professional, less, authoritative, etc. Uh, so all these forms, using them is shown to correlate. Again, I'm going back to the fact that this is qualitative research, not quantitative. So we can talk only about tendencies. So they, excuse me, they correlate. Um, I'm sorry, there's a typo here. I will correct these typos before I send you the presentation. Um, to the extent to which someone is perceived as a good job candidate, right? Meaning that it ultimately can affect the probability of you getting a job, right? So these were mostly in the job interview context. Now, in legal contexts, in the trial, etc., the situation is not really clear. But for example, I thought it was interesting to mention this study from 2009 that showed that um, this is experimental setting, not real court setting, but it was stimulating that kind of setting. Showed that the subjects attributed greater fault to the speakers, be it a defendant or the plaintiff, that is using too much of a high power style, right? Because you have to think that in legal contexts, you don't want people to seem as if they are trying to cover something, right? So using too much of powerful speech can be bad in that context. And this, when you're talking about this language or communication analysis in legal context, there is a whole new field that I'm not even mentioning enough here, called forensic linguistics. Um, and forensic linguistics has to do with, it's a very interesting field. It has to do with analyzing texts, audios, and videos where people are, in legal context. For example, if you have a suspect, or you have to determine if a certain text is coming from, and the two, for example, two letters, for example, are coming from the same person, or if you hear two audios forensic linguists will help with this. And closely with them, you have people who are also behavioral scientists, and they were more focused on, subconscious things that we are talking about here, such as body language that I haven't even mentioned in this presentation, which is again a whole new topic, body language, which is also a way of communicating. That's why it's called language. So behaviors and body language together with the choice of words, together with usage of these forms, powerless and powerful, these are all informative in the legal settings. When you have to analyze how the suspect is behaving, they are usually not determining something, but they help detectives decide, etc. Whereas the forensic linguistic is a little bit more exact science, and they are usually employed by the police, forensic linguists to, solve something or help them decide, as I said, whether, for example, two texts are coming from the same person, right? So this is when it comes to powerful and powerless speech. And this is only one, just scratching the surface of it, just so that you're aware that imagine that, in the context, you go to a job interview and you're prepared, you're focused on the content of what you're saying, which you should, but there are so many things in our voice, in the choice of these little hesitations that we don't even choose on purpose, right? That are communicating something to the person listening to us that we are not even aware. And then I would move to the discourse analysis in media. This will be the last thing I will be talking about here today. Um, Again, from a linguist point of view, linguists very early, early, let's say in the 70s or 80s, early for linguistics, which is not such an old science. Linguists started paying attention to, the relations between language and ideology in the media, going back to the politics, right? So, and just starting with the basic things, focusing on the grammatical structures that people are using in media messages, or, for example, in newspapers. And you can there already see that certain messages are being framed and that certain ideologies are being set up, uh, even on the level of the syntax, right? Or, for example, that they reveal biases in reporting, going back to biases, right? So what you use, what kind of structure you use, might affect that people see that person as responsible for something. For example, if you use active sentence, somebody did something, that is very different from saying something is being done using a passive sentence, right? Because it will affect how people perceive the situation that you're describing. So journalists, people who are, very important for the mass communication, because they are the one that are shaping the messages that are going to the masses, have to be very, very careful about these subconscious biases, unconscious biases, and about these stereotypes that they are implicit, they're implicit, and they should try to minimize them, right? Um, and then we have this study where the media discourse is classified in three subfields. As you can see, only one of them is actually linguistic. The second one is sociolinguistic, talking about what is happening in the society. So, the language that you're using is actually trying to sell that idea or say something bad about that idea, give an impression that some idea or some belief is bad or good, can be achieved through language, right? And then we also have other non-linguistic things, okay? For example, I will give here two examples of the studies that are being done on the discourse analysis in media. Something very recent, COVID-19. There is this study that went through a lot of public media discourses on TV and on newspapers that are actually representing nurses. as, caring, those that that make a lot of sacrifice, that are our heroes, etc. And you can really see that that kind of narrative is being, put in the media about nurses being, taking all the sacrifice. But interestingly, what they found, and this is just, how discourse affects real life, what they found is that that media discourse affected their ability to maintain their personal safety as a result of the expectations that are put upon them in the nursing profession, right? So because public and media is always presenting them as, these caring, heroic creatures, they will less likely think about their safety, and they will more likely put themselves in danger, because that is expected of them because of the discourse that is being put in the media, right? And another very big study, I think that this study analyzed many, many, many texts and sources from 2013. For example, how the British press represent Islam, and all the phrases that are used, and the phrases that are chosen instead of the other phrases, right? This all affects how people are, there are a lot of stereotypes in Britain related to that. So it really affects how people are perceiving Islam. And the last thing, I already talked about this, is advertising. This is, to go a little bit practical at the end of all this. How can all this knowledge be put into practice? Advertising is a good example, as I said previously, because the when you're advertising, you are selling a product. That is your aim, right? But in order to sell a product, as I said, remember the confirmation bias idea that I mentioned before. Well, people want to hear what they believe in, right? So you have to, the language that you choose for advertising has to reflect the values, the emotion, even ideologies, right? Why are, the commercials for, cars or some kind of luxury products always different, have a different tone, always using some kind of words such as style, life, uh, depicting a man coming out of an expensive hotel or something, whereas some other products, such as, I don't know, yogurt, that is aimed at, maybe moms, is going to use a more light-hearted language, who's going to use words that that are associated with health, with nature, with, family, etc., right? And the commercial will be happy kids running around, right? So you want to actually tap into what people want to hear, what they believe in, so you will choose your language accordingly. And definitely, there's a lot of research showing that using certain forms can result in better advertising effects, right? Not just the words that you use, but how you decide to put them. For example, this study from 2022 concluded that the meta discourse, that is how you chunk, how you organize your information into smaller sections, right? Both visually, when you look at something, when you look at the language, and also linguistically, that plays a vital role in how the discourse is structured, and that affects how messages are understood, how much audience, people who are listening, is engaged, and how much interest is being caught. Um, so that is a very important thing about persuasive writing, right? This is in the end what advertising is. It's persuasive writing, persuading you to do something. But as I said, it's not always just about selling the product. It's not always about, using and making use of these subconscious bias. Sometimes it's for good causes, such as it's called advocacy advertising, that is used in nonprofit organizations, for example, to promote good causes and to call attention to pressing social issues, like, I don't know, health campaigns, when, we had these campaigns and advertisements about, get vaccinated. Then we had UNICEF advertising. You notice that they are using very strong language, very emotional language that always that aims to elicit sympathy and to make us help, and they should. Um, the other important the other important term here is subvertising, which is a verb, which is a word made up of two words: subversive, meaning subconscious, and advertising, right? Why is this important? Because of everything I was talking about, that actually there are a lot of things that we are not aware of as people who are receiving information. And this is why, advertising has actually very high manipulative and exploitative potential because it can manipulate the things that we are not aware they're being manipulated, right? So, what are the take home messages here? A lot of our behaviors, communication behaviors, um, be it conscious or not, are communicating something to the others that we are not aware of, right? We can use that to our advantage, but don't obsess over it. Now, if after this lecture, you go and you're like, oh my God, I have to be careful about what I'm saying, in what way, how I'm sitting, where I'm looking, what kind of tone I have. I mean, people are people. They will have these implicit stereotypes and they will have these implicit biases that we cannot fight, right? So I cannot change the fact that I am, a woman. So somebody might perceive my speech as less powerful just because I'm a woman, and maybe then because of that I get, lower grade, or don't get a job at a job interview. I cannot change that. So maybe be aware of it if you need it for something, or if you want to improve your, for example, communication style, if that's important for your job, but don't obsess over it. We as humans are more open to receiving information or understanding certain information if presented in a certain way, right? So the form matters here, not just the content. And you can use this to your advantage if you're doing public speaking, if you're advertising, etc. But again, don't obsess over it. Or we can use it to be maybe a little bit more conscious consumers, and know that people who are trying to sell things to us know exactly what they're doing, right? But we can also use it to our advantage if we are dealing with mass communication or public speaking, etc. And that will be all for today. I think we have a little bit of time for questions. So